And now the subject you've all been waiting for. What about that Dagesh? I tend to call it Dagesh, but that's wrong. But it's very dogged of me to call it Dagesh. But anyway, it's Dagesh. Hebrew in general tends to pronounce words with the accent on the last syllable. So Dagesh makes sense. Anyway, let's talk about the Dagesh. So there are two kinds of Dagesh. Very simple. The kind that doubles the letter. This is the one that affects the meaning. This is the one that you really have to pay attention to because it changes, it can change what is actually going on with the meaning of the word. And the other kind is the kind that hardens the sound of the letter. This is not really that important. Well, it's not important at all to the meaning, but it does change the way you might pronounce the word. The first one is kind of like, oh, that's fun. The second one is like, why? Why did they do this? But ours is not to question why. Ours is just to memorize or die. So let's start with the hardening Dagesh. This is the one that is meaningless, that simply has to do with the sound. It's also called the light Dagesh or the Dagesh Lene. Dagesh Lene. Lene is Latin for light. So the hardening Dagesh only appears in the Begad Kafat letters. And if you've been following this series of videos, you know what those are. They are Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Kaf, Pei, and Tav. And these are the letters that, again, ours is not to question why, they can have a dot in them. They can have a Dagesh in them. It has no change in the meaning, whether the Dagesh is there or not. It simply indicates whether the sound is hardened or not. So, for example, when the bet has the Dagesh, it's B. When the bet does not have the Dagesh, it's V. You might even call it a different letter, bet vet, although it's not a different letter. Let's not do that. Gimel, I'm going to pronounce them both G. Duh, I'm going to pronounce them both duh. Although with the Dagesh, duh is normal. Without the Dagesh, some pronounce it the. I'm not going to, but you might. Kaf, I'm going to pronounce it k either way. Pei, I do make a difference. So the bet and the pei I pronounce differently, whether it has the Dagesh or not. So the pei is p, a p sound when it has the Dagesh, but it's f, like a ph sound when it doesn't have the Dagesh. I'm going to pronounce the tav as t either way, but there are some who pronounce the t as th when it doesn't have the Dagesh. Anyway, doesn't change the meaning at all, just a question of how to pronounce it. So the hardening Dagesh only appears in the Begad Kafat letters. It has no meaning. It only indicates that the sound is hardened, for lack of a better word. When does it do this? It does this at the beginning of a word. So if a Dagesh is in a Begad Kafat letter at the beginning of a word, then you know that it's just a hardening Dagesh. It's a light Dagesh. It's simply saying, pronounce it buh or whatever. A first letter is never doubled in Hebrew. First letter is never doubled. Doubled letters are almost always in the middle of a word in Hebrew. So at the beginning of a syllable. So there are two kinds of syllables in Hebrew. There's open syllables and closed syllables. An open syllable is a consonant and a vowel, like ba, and then a closed syllable would have consonant, vowel, consonant, like bod, or something like that. It ends. So at the beginning of a syllable, a Begad Kafat letter is with a Dagesh in it is simply a light Dagesh or a hardening Dagesh. So more important to meaning is the doubling Dagesh. So if you see, this is the Dagesh forte, or the Dagesh, the strong, I'm a strong Dagesh. When does this happen? Well, in any other letter than a Begad Kafat letter. So if you see a Dagesh in any letter other than a Begad Kafat letter, it's doubling the letter. One exception is the final hey, and I'll end this video with that. But in general, when it's not in a Begad Kafat letter, if there's a Dagesh in it, it is a doubling Dagesh, which means when you transliterate it, you need to write the letter twice. And it does affect the meaning. So a confusing bit here is that Begad Kafat letters can also, you can have a Dagesh in a Begad Kafat letter that, yes, it does harden the sound too. But if a Dagesh at the end of a syllable, like, remember I said consonant, vowel, consonant would be a closed syllable. If you have a dagesh in a begad kafat letter at the end of a syllable, which, because it doubles, would then both end a syllable and begin a syllable. Anyway, this will become clearer. Kind of, what do I need to know to begin with? To begin with, begad kafat letter might very well be just a hardening dagesh. Any other letter, it's a doubling dagesh. That's the way to start. And then as we go along, you'll eventually learn how to say, oh, I realize that this is a begad kafat letter, but it's actually doubling it here. But the main thing to know, the big takeaway from this video is, if a dagesh is in a begad kafat letter, it's probably a hardening dagesh, just changing the sound, no meaning. If it's in any other letter, it's a doubling dagesh, that is doubling the letter, and that is meaningful. Okay, here's an example of a doubling dagesh. Remember that this is from Jonah 1:1, Jonah, son of Amittai. So Aleph, that's a Ketef Patak, Mem, Hirik, and then here's a begad kafat letter. But it's a doubling begad kafat letter. How do I know that? Because it is both closing a mit and beginning a tai. So the first tav ends the mit, and in the second tav begins the tai. And so it's in a closed syllable. M-I-T is a closed syllable. And then T-A-Y is also closed syllable, although that's just doesn't matter. Now here's another example of a doubling dagesh. Here the dagesh is in a lamed, and because lamed is not a begad kafat letter, that must be a doubling dagesh. And so you see, when I've transliterated it with two lameds. Okay, so we end this video with the mapiq. What is the mapiq? The mapiq is a dot in a hay. See, and it's always a final hay. So you're not going to see a mapiq in a hay anywhere other than a final hay. And so most of the time when you see a hay at the end of a word, it's a mater lactionis. It's a piggyback for a vowel, a kamatz hay, which we talked about in previous videos. So most of the time, a final hay is not a consonant at all. It's just kind of a help to say, there's a vowel here. But sometimes a final hay is a real consonant with a special meaning, and when that's the case, it'll have a mapiq. Usually, when that takes place, it's a pronoun, a pronominal possessive suffix, and so that's when you'll want to pay attention to it. More on that later. But this, for the time being, has been the dagesh, how to tell the difference between the two different kinds of dagesh.